Hi, my name's Andy Sykes. I'm an illustrator and animator, and I teach animation at universities here in the UK. Why not check out my website, hexjibber.com, where you can find animation and illustration by me, as well as more lessons in Flash and After Effects. Cheers! Hi, and welcome to my tutorial on what's new in Flash Professional CC 2014. As they did this time last year, Adobe have released a load of updates for all of its Creative Suite, including Flash. So let's take a look at some of the new features. First off, let's take a look at variable width strokes. If you've used Illustrator before, you might have come across variable width strokes. They do kind of what it says on the tin. If I grab my line tool and draw a stroke across my screen, I can go up to my stroke options and push the thickness up so we can see it a little bit better. And if I go a little bit further down underneath my style menu, I've got this width option. And if I click on that, I can choose from various different preset width profiles. So this is just the same as you would see in Illustrator. And I can choose one of those from the menu. I'm going to choose width profile 1. And you can see what it's done is created this really nice expressive line which tapers at both ends. So this is really useful if you're wanting to create more expressive graphics for your character animation, or if you're drawing in Flash, or if you're just wanting to do something that looks a little bit different. If I'd imported a variable width stroke from Illustrator, it would convert it to a fill, which would mean that I couldn't edit it further if I wanted. But because we've created this in Flash, I can use my selection tool to bend it about, and it'll keep that variable width and it'll recalculate it. So I think this would be really good for an eyebrow, for example, because it tapers at the end and it looks really nice. If I hold down Alt, I can add extra points along my shape. So perhaps if I want it to lie a bit flatter at the end, I could do that. So that's how you can use variable width profiles. If I delete that line and draw another, it'll draw it using the last width profile I had selected. I'll put it back on uniform, and then I'll go over here to this new width tool in my toolbar. This is a way of manually creating your own width profile. So if I click and drag, you can see that I can make a nice thick width profile which tapers a little bit at the end. And I can add as many of these as I like. So let's add one more. I'm going to shrink it down a little bit there. And if I want, I can also shrink down existing points. So I can make it taper off completely at the end, like that. And this is still a stroke. So I can still edit it. I can make it round if I want. So this gives you a huge amount of control, and there's lots and lots of possibilities for using these new variable widths. But not only can you draw them, you can also animate them as well. So I'm just going to delete this one and draw another. I'm going to put my width profile 1 on. And I'm going to set another keyframe at frame 20 by pressing F6. And I'm going to change the width profile to this one, width profile 2. So this is what I've got on keyframe 1, and this is what I've got on keyframe 2. And in the middle, I'm going to create a shape tween. And now what Flash does, this is a brand new feature, is it's going to tween between those two variable width profiles. It looks very, very cool. Let's take a look at an example I've created for this tutorial. What I've got here is a few different keyframes which have all the different variable width profiles on them. And as you can see, Flash animates smoothly between all of them. So there's lots of potential for using this type of animation for creating expressive character animation. Let's take a quick look at some of the other consequences of this new feature. I often animate using strokes like this. And I use it if I'm doing very simple stickmen animations for corporate clients. And something that I find very irritating in Flash is if I draw a vertical line like this, and I try and shape tween it so that it goes diagonally like this, You'd think that would be a pretty simple animation for Flash to do. But if I play it through, it kind of swaps the ends over. And if you watch my shape tweening tutorials, you'll know that you can fix this using something called shape hints. But sometimes they don't work quite as well as you would like, and it can be quite irritating. But something I've noticed from having a play around with Flash CC 2014 is if you do the same animation but apply a variable width profile, it actually fixes that problem and it'll animate in a much more logical way. So let's take a look at the same animation, but the second keyframe has a variable width on it, like so. So let's take a look. You can see that line animates in a way that we would expect it to. If I click on my variable width stroke and change the width back to uniform, you'll see it unfixes itself. And you might be saying to me, I don't want a tapered stroke in my animation, so what use is this to me? Well, if we use the brand new width tool, we can use this to keep the look of the line exactly the same, but fix the problem. So what I'm going to do is go over to my line, and I'm going to use the width tool to create another width point. But I'm going to make it exactly the same size as the stroke, as if it were uniform. And once we've done that, you can see that that fixes the problem, but it keeps it looking exactly the same. We get a much better animation, and you should find this type of shape tweening a lot easier now that that feature has been brought in. One of the other cool new features in Flash CC 2014 isn't actually a new feature at all. It's an old feature that they got rid of in Flash CC, and they've now reintroduced in Flash CC 2014. It's called Object Level Undo. I used to use it a lot, and I was quite annoyed that they got rid of it in the last version of Flash. So if you want to use it, you have to go to the Flash menu, go to Preferences, and then in the General part of the Preferences, choose the Undo option, Object Level Undo. It'll default to Document Level Undo, but we want to select Object Level Undo. Click OK. And just so we understand the difference between Document Level Undo and Object Level Undo, what I've got here is two symbols. And Object Level Undo will only work on symbols, it won't work on groups or drawing objects. First off, we're going to make some changes to this hexagon. I just double clicked on it and you can see that we've gone inside the hexagon symbol. We're in isolation mode. I'm going to use my brush. So I'm going to change the color of my brush to red. I'm going to scribble all over this hexagon just so that we've made a change to it. Then I'm going to click back to scene 1 and I'm going to make some changes to this circle symbol. So I'm going to double click on that and you can see we're inside our circle symbol in scene 1. And I think I'm going to choose a different color, making sure that my circle's not selected anymore. In pink, I'm going to do some scribbling. And then I'm going to do smiley face. There we go. Wonderful. And I'm going to go back to scene 1. Now, I'm very happy with my wonderful smiley face that I've drawn here. I think it's probably one of the best things I've ever done. But I'm not so fond of this red scribble that I've done on my hexagon. The problem is, if I was using document level undo, I would have to undo all of my changes on this circle and lose my wonderful smiley face in order to get rid of this red in my hexagon. But if we're using object level undo, we can keep the smiley face and just get rid of the red using undo. Let's check out how to do that. We're going to double click on my hexagon, and if I hit Command Z on the Mac or Control Z on the PC, you'll see it gets rid of that red, but it leaves the smiley face intact, even though we did that after we did the scribble on the hexagon. So instead of doing it chronologically, instead of undoing things as we did them, we can undo them on a object by object basis. This is really useful if you're doing animation and you're making little changes to different symbols over a period of time and you only want to change certain bits and keep others. So object level undo, perhaps a little bit difficult to understand if you haven't used it before, but it's very, very useful. And personally, I'm glad that they brought it back. So another new feature in Flash CC 2014 is also an old feature that they've reintroduced. In the last version of Flash, in Flash CC, they got rid of the motion editor for the new types of tweens that was present from Flash CS4 onwards. They've reintroduced that now, but they've cleaned it up and made it easier to understand. I still don't particularly like using the new tweens because I think they overcomplicate things, but they're really good for doing particular types of smooth and complex animation. So what I'm going to do to create one of these new types of tweens, I'm going to hit F5 and expand the span of this hexagon symbol that I've got, my timeline. So it exists for 25 frames. I'm going to right click on it and create a motion tween. If you've never used these before, I do recommend that you check out my new motion tweens tutorials on my website, hexjibber.com. So what we need to do now is move to the end of our span and just move the hexagon somewhere. And you can see that we get this motion line appearing, showing us the motion of our hexagon. If we want, we can move this first keyframe all the way over to the left so that we get this nice long animation of the hexagon moving, like so. And the cool things about these motion lines is you can arc them up and change the way that the hexagon moves. That's something that you can't do with classic tweens. In the past, there was a separate motion editor for editing these new motion tweens, but now, instead of that existing, it all displays in the timeline. So I'm going to double click on this span here, as we call it, and you'll see that we get our motion graph for both the X and the Y here in our timeline, which is a lot clearer than it used to be. So what I can do is if I want to add an ease to both X and Y, I click on location, go over to add ease, and I can choose from lots of presets that already exist. Go to choose a simple one, choose fastest. So that's essentially easing out, where it starts off quickly and it gradually slows down. You can see that all the points along this path are much closer towards the end. So if we play that through now, you can see that it starts off quickly, gradually slows down as it moves along. But say if we decide that we want this animation to rotate, we'll go to my properties and select to rotate once. But if we want to change how the rotation looks, which currently looks like this, we can add an ease to that. So for example, if we wanted our rotation to spring, we could try applying that ease. And you can see that the rotation now has that springing ease applied to it, and it stops springing towards the end of the animation. So rotates a lot at the beginning and then stops towards the end. The cool thing about this is you're able to edit the eases on all the different properties within an animation. So you can ease the rotation in a different way to the X and Y position values, and it gives you a lot more control. The problem I have with these types of tweens as opposed to classic tweens is if we hit F6 at frame 40 and create a new keyframe, say move the hexagon up here, if we play it through, the eases that we applied earlier will stretch all the way across not just the first two keyframes you made, but all three of the keyframes that we've created, which is no good if you're wanting a separate ease to go from frame 25 to frame 40. If you want to do that, let's just undo a few steps before we create that third keyframe. What you can do is insert a new keyframe by pressing F6 and right click on it and go to split motion. This feature's been around for a long time. It's not new in this version of Flash, but I find that it makes things easier. So if we create a new keyframe and move our hexagon over here, we can double click on that span and apply whatever eases we want to that. So we could get rid of the spring, have no ease on the rotation, and we could put a slow on both X and Y. There we go. And play that animation through. You can see we've got two separate eases on two separate spans of our animation. I find that this is a much easier way of working with these new types of tweens. Obviously, you'll have your own way of using them. I think the way that they've tidied up the motion editing process is good. I'm still not going to be using these new types of tweens. I'm going to be sticking with the classic tweens because I find them easier to use. Let's take a look at one more feature new to Flash CC 2014. Here we've got a picture from my anti-revision book, which is available on Amazon. And of course, it's vectors. I've drawn it in Flash. But I want to import it into Illustrator to add some extra things to it, which I can only do there. And I might want to prep it for print in Illustrator because its tools for doing that are much better than in Flash. I used to use a file format called FXG, which was introduced in Flash CS4, but Adobe got rid of it in Flash CC, leaving me with no way to export my images as vectors. I either had to render them as bitmaps or just use an earlier version of Flash. But in this new version of Flash, we've got the option to export as an SVG, which is a very common type of vector format, and it can be read by lots of different programs. So if we want to save this file as an SVG, what we can do is go to File, Export, Export Image. I'm going to choose to save mine to the desktop, and I'm going to choose File Format SVG, and I'm going to click Save. We get these options here for including hidden layers. So if you've hidden anything like my guide layer here, you can include that. I'm going to untick it. If you've used any bitmap images, you can either embed them in the file or you can link to them in a folder called Images, which Flash will create. But I don't have any bitmaps in this image, so I don't need to worry about that. I'm going to click OK. And there we go, we've created our SVG. So let's just open that up in Illustrator. You can see when I double click on the file, I get this clipping will be lost on round trip to tiny. That refers to the text. If I click OK, you can see that our image has come through very well, but unfortunately our text hasn't. My little custom font that I use hasn't been carried over. This will happen if you're using any font, even the most standard ones. You can see all of my graphics have come through and they're vectors. They're looking great. It looks exactly the same as it does in Flash. So there we go, fantastic. But in order to get around the fact that it can't import text properly, we have to go back into Flash. We're going to have to break up this text so it becomes vector graphics and it'll export in the way that we want. So I'm going to click on the text. I'm going to hit Command B once and then again. And I think I'm going to make that into a group using Command G. So now if we go to File, Export, Export Image, it's right over the one we just created. Click OK. I'm going to open that up in Illustrator. And we can see that our text is there looking perfect, just as we want it to. So it's not quite as good as FXG because that used to be able to carry text over into Illustrator as well, but it is a very good alternative for exporting your vector graphics from Flash into other applications like Illustrator and CorelDRAW and Inkscape and anything else that uses the SVG format. One thing that I'm not going to cover in this tutorial because it's already been covered very well on Adobe's site is the new feature of being able to export content as a WebGL. So I'll put a link to this in the description on this video so you can check it out. And if you were ever very keen on using the projector format in Flash, that's been reintroduced as well. So that's just a quick look at the new features in Flash Professional CC 2014. If you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Hey, thanks for checking out this tutorial. Next up, why not take a look at my website, hexjibber.com, where you can find out more about my self-published books, the Hexjibber Colouring and Activity Book, and the Hexjibber Anti-Revision Book. They're both suitable for kids and adults alike, and are well worth checking out.